No one was supposed to hear a voice out there in that storm. But the mountains don't stay silent when something alive is still calling for help. The wind over the Montana backcountry moved like a living force, bending pine trees and swallowing every trace of sound beneath a thick, endless snowstorm that turned the world into a white void. Visibility dropped to just a few yards, and the horizon disappeared as if the earth itself had been erased. Somewhere inside that frozen silence, Marines on a routine search and recovery sweep stopped in place when the sound came again, faint and uneven, like a cry carried through miles of ice and wind. Sergeant Daniel Whitaker raised a closed fist, signaling his unit to halt. His breath slowed as he listened harder, trying to separate imagination from reality. But the sound returned, softer now, not human, not mechanical, something fragile enough to vanish if the wind shifted even slightly. "You hear that?" one of the Marines asked, voice low beneath his scarf. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He had learned in places far from home that doubt could cost seconds, and seconds could cost everything. Instead, he adjusted his tactical gloves and stepped forward, boots pressing into nearly 2 feet of fresh snow that swallowed every sound he made. The cold cut through his jacket in layers, but he kept moving, guided by instinct more than visibility, until the shape of the terrain blurred into ghostly forms of buried rocks and frozen brush. Behind him, the team spread carefully, scanning with thermal optics that struggled against the density of the storm. The world felt abandoned, like it had been left unfinished mid-breath. Then came the sound again, closer this time, not a cry of distress, but something steadier, almost deliberate, like a signal meant to be heard by someone willing to listen long enough. Daniel stopped at the edge of a shallow depression where the snow had gathered deeper than the surrounding field. He knelt slowly, one hand pressing into the ice crust for balance, and that's when he saw it, a faint disturbance in the white, a shape barely distinguishable from the storm itself. "Movement, 12 o'clock low," he said into his radio, his voice calm but sharpened by focus. The team tightened formation behind him, but Daniel raised his hand again, signaling silence. Whatever was out there was not running, not hiding, but waiting. The wind shifted suddenly, and for a brief second the storm opened like a curtain. In that fragile window of clarity, a figure emerged from the snow, not a person, but a dog, a German shepherd, its coat almost entirely white, blending with the landscape so perfectly it looked like a reflection of the storm itself. It stood unsteady but alert, its body trembling from cold rather than fear. In its mouth, it carried something dark against the endless white. Daniel's eyes narrowed as he took a step forward, slowly, carefully, as if approaching a skittish survivor. The dog did not retreat. Instead, it took one hesitant step closer, then another, until the object in its mouth became clear. Dog tags, metal, worn, reflecting what little light the storm allowed. The Marines behind Daniel exchanged uncertain glances, but he didn't look away. Something about the dog's eyes held him in place, not aggression, not panic, but intention, like it had come there for a reason it refused to abandon. "Easy," Daniel whispered, lowering himself further into the snow until he was at eye level with the animal. The wind pressed harder, trying to erase the moment, but the dog held steady, breathing shallow but controlled, as if it had been waiting far longer than the storm itself. Slowly, carefully, it lowered the dog tags into the snow between them. The metal made a soft, final sound as it touched the ice, and for a moment, everything in the world seemed to stop moving. Daniel stared at the tags without touching them, as if recognizing them before reading a single word. His throat tightened, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something memory had buried but never erased. The dog did not bark or move. It simply sat, watching him, as though it had completed a mission only it understood. Behind them, the storm continued to rage, but within that small circle of silence, something far heavier than weather had just begun to surface. The moment the dog tags touched the frozen ground, the Marines remained completely still, as if the storm itself had commanded silence rather than the sergeant. Snow continued to fall in thick, heavy sheets, covering everything within seconds, yet none of them moved to retrieve the metal plates. Daniel Whitaker stared at them with a focus that felt heavier than the cold pressing against his skin. The engraved letters were partially worn, but still readable enough to strike something deep inside memory. Behind him, one of the Marines lowered his voice and asked if they should secure the area, but Daniel raised a hand slightly, not as an order, but as hesitation made visible. The white German shepherd remained seated, eyes locked on Daniel, its breath slow and controlled despite the harsh wind cutting across the valley. It did not behave like a stray or a lost animal. It behaved like something that had completed a long journey and refused to leave until its message was understood. Daniel finally reached down, not touching the tags yet, but hovering close enough to confirm what he already feared he recognized. The name etched into the metal pulled him backward in time, not into chaos or battle, but into quieter moments he had long buried, moments of shared silence between missions, moments of trust built in places where trust was rare. His jaw tightened slightly, and he exhaled through his nose, steadying himself before speaking. "This belongs to Sergeant Michael Reeves," he said quietly, the name carried away slightly by the wind, but not lost to those standing close. No one responded immediately. The Marines behind him exchanged brief glances, understanding without needing explanation. Sergeant Michael Reeves had been part of their unit, someone who had gone missing during a recovery operation months earlier in terrain not far from where they now stood. The official reports had left much unanswered, and over time, silence had replaced inquiry. Yet here, in the middle of a snowstorm that seemed determined to erase all certainty, the answer had returned in the most unexpected form. Daniel finally lifted the tags carefully, as if they carried more weight than metal alone, and as he did, the German shepherd stood slowly, turning its head toward the darker line of trees ahead. It gave a single low sound, not a bark, not a whine, but something closer to a call, as though it was reminding them that the story was not finished here. One of the Marines suggested they return to the transport vehicle until the storm eased, but Daniel shook his head once, his attention fixed entirely on the dog. There was no aggression in its posture, only direction, and direction in conditions like this was never accidental. Daniel rose to his feet slowly, placing the dog tag securely in his inner jacket pocket, then signaled the team to follow his lead. The white shepherd began to move forward without hesitation, stepping into deeper snow where visibility dropped again almost instantly. Each step it took seemed deliberate, as though it knew the land beneath the snow far better than anything visible on the surface. The Marines followed at a cautious distance, their boots sinking into fresh accumulation that muffled all sound except the wind. The world around them had become a blank canvas of motionless white, broken only by the faint outline of the dog ahead, which appeared and disappeared as the storm shifted. Daniel kept his eyes forward, occasionally glancing at the compass strapped to his wrist, but instinct had already begun to override instrumentation. There was something familiar in the way the dog moved, something disciplined, almost trained, yet not in any military sense he could immediately identify. It moved like it was following memory rather than scent. As they advanced deeper into the frozen terrain, the wind softened briefly, and in that rare moment of clarity, Daniel noticed faint disturbances in the snow ahead, not footprints exactly, but patterns of compression that suggested prolonged presence in the area. The dog paused at the edge of a partially obscured ridge and looked back once, confirming they were still following, then continued forward. Daniel felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with temperature. The landscape ahead was uneven, shaped by natural collapse and time, but there was also something else, a structure of sorts barely visible, beneath layers of frost and accumulation. As they approached, the shape became clearer, not a building, but something closer to a makeshift shelter formed against the land itself, partially buried and silent under winter's weight. The white shepherd stopped at its edge and lowered its head slightly, as if acknowledging arrival. Daniel stepped forward carefully, brushing snow aside with his glove, revealing fragments of equipment frozen into place, worn fabric, and markings that had faded with time. The realization settled slowly across the team, not as shock, but as understanding that this place had been holding onto something longer than anyone had expected. Daniel stood still, looking at the dog again, and for a moment, he did not see just an animal, but a continuation of duty that had never stopped. The storm circled above them, relentless and unchanging, but beneath it, something long forgotten was beginning to surface. The white German shepherd stood at the edge of the half-buried structure without moving, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to allow the Marines to finally understand what it had been trying to lead them toward. The wind had grown heavier again, pushing waves of snow across the broken terrain, but inside that small depression of land, everything felt strangely still, almost protected from the chaos above. Sergeant Daniel Whitaker stepped closer first, his boots sinking into compacted layers of ice and frozen debris that had formed uneven ridges around the hidden structure. He raised a gloved hand, signaling the rest of the team to hold position behind him. His breath came slowly, controlled, as he scanned what little was visible beneath the snow. The outline suggested something man-made, reinforced at one point, now collapsed and partially reclaimed by nature. He crouched and began brushing away the upper layer of snow carefully, revealing weathered metal plating and fragments of faded markings that suggested military origin. One of the Marines behind him whispered that it could be an old emergency shelter or a supply cache from a previous operation cycle, but Daniel did not respond immediately. His focus was on the dog, which had now moved slightly closer, sitting beside him with an unusual stillness, watching every motion as if confirming that progress was correct. As more of the structure became visible, the sense of familiarity deepened in Daniel's expression, though he could not yet place it fully. The design elements, the placement of reinforcement panels, even the angle at which it had been constructed against the natural slope of the land all suggested something purposeful, not accidental abandonment. The snow continued to fall around them, but the space they occupied felt increasingly narrow, as if the world beyond the ridge no longer existed. Daniel pressed his hand against a section of the exposed surface and felt a faint vibration through the material, likely caused by wind pressure against hollow space beneath. He paused, then signaled for one of the Marines to bring a compact thermal scanner. The device activated with a low hum, projecting faint readings that flickered uncertainly due to interference from the storm, but even through the distortion, there was a suggestion of enclosed space below ground level. Daniel's eyes shifted briefly to the German shepherd, whose gaze remained steady, unblinking, directed toward a specific point near the base of the structure. Trusting that instinct, Daniel knelt and began clearing snow from that exact area. As layers fell away, a narrow access point began to emerge, partially sealed but not completely collapsed, as if it had been reinforced at some point before being left untouched for a long period. The metal frame around it was worn and cold to the touch, and faint traces of numbering could still be seen etched into the side. The weather had erased most of the detail. One of the Marines suggested waiting for engineering support before attempting entry, but Daniel raised a hand again, not out of urgency, but recognition that hesitation might erase something already fragile. He reached for the latch mechanism and tested it gently. It resisted at first, frozen and stiff from time and temperature, but after careful pressure it gave way with a low mechanical release sound that disappeared quickly into the wind. A small gap opened, releasing a rush of colder air from within, carrying with it a silence that felt heavier than the storm outside. Daniel paused before widening the opening further, his eyes adjusting to the darkness inside. The interior was dim, but intact enough to suggest it had been used as more than just temporary shelter. Faint outlines of stored equipment and emergency provisions could be seen along the interior wall, though much of it was covered in frost. The German shepherd moved forward slightly, placing its front paws near the entrance but not crossing it, as if waiting for permission that did not need to be spoken. Daniel glanced back at his team briefly, then returned his attention to the opening. The name on the dog tags in his pocket felt heavier now than before, not because of what they had found, but because of what they had not yet fully understood. He activated a small portable light and directed it into the space below, revealing deeper layers of the structure extending downward rather than inward. The realization shifted the atmosphere immediately. This was not simply a shelter left behind. It was part of a larger system of hidden survival infrastructure designed for extreme conditions. Daniel lowered himself carefully to the threshold, listening. Inside, there was no movement, only the faint echo of wind passing through unseen channels beneath the snow. Yet the German shepherd let out a soft sound, almost imperceptible, and stepped back slightly, as if signaling that what lay below was not danger, but memory. Daniel exhaled slowly, steadying himself, then began to descend. Daniel Whitaker descended carefully into the narrow access point, each step into the frozen interior feeling like a crossing into a place where time had stopped. The portable light in his hand cut through the darkness in a narrow beam, revealing steel-lined walls coated with a thin layer of frost that shimmered like glass under pressure. The air inside was still, colder than the storm above, but strangely preserved, as if the space had been sealed away from the passage of seasons. Behind him, the faint sound of wind faded quickly, replaced by a deep quiet that pressed against the ears a way that made even breathing feel louder than usual. The white German shepherd remained at the entrance above, watching silently, its posture unchanged, as though it had no need to follow further because it already knew what would be found below. Daniel continued downward until his boots reached a flat surface, and the beam of light revealed a corridor extending forward, narrow but intact, reinforced at intervals with aged structural supports. Along the walls were faded markings, numbers, and symbols partially obscured by frost and time, suggesting that this was once part of a coordinated military survival system designed for extreme weather operations in remote terrain. He moved slowly, scanning the corridor as he advanced, his radio silent except for faint static from the storm interference above. The space carried traces of human presence, not recent, but not entirely distant either, as though it had held onto memory longer than it should have. After several yards, the corridor opened into a slightly larger chamber where the ceiling was higher and the walls showed signs of temporary occupation. Daniel swept the light across the room and noticed arranged equipment crates, some still sealed, others opened and left in orderly condition rather than abandoned chaos. There were thermal blankets folded against one wall, emergency ration packs stacked with precision, and a medical kit mounted in a recessed compartment. Everything suggested discipline rather than evacuation under panic. Daniel knelt briefly beside one of the crates and brushed away a layer of frost from its surface, revealing a faded unit designation marking that immediately caught his attention. His expression tightened slightly as recognition began to form, though he did not speak it aloud. This was connected to an operation he had once been indirectly attached to, a mission that had ended without full recovery reports and had gradually faded into classified silence. The silence in the chamber felt different now, no longer empty, but expectant, as if the space itself was waiting for acknowledgement. Daniel stood again and moved toward the far end of the room where the corridor extended deeper, but his attention shifted when he noticed a faint disturbance near a raised platform constructed against the back wall. As he approached, the beam of light revealed a carefully arranged resting area, not makeshift, but intentionally maintained over time, with insulation layers and protective coverings still in place. On top of it lay a folded field jacket, partially frozen into the surface, and beside it rested additional dog tags, arranged in a way that suggested deliberate placement rather than loss. Daniel felt a quiet pressure in his chest as he stepped closer, the realization forming slowly rather than arriving all at once. He reached out and lifted one set of tags, confirming what his instincts had already suggested earlier. The name matched, and with it came the weight of understanding that this place had not been forgotten, but preserved. Behind him, faint movement echoed from above as the German shepherd shifted position at the entrance, letting out a low, steady sound that carried down the corridor like confirmation. Daniel closed his hand around the tags and exhaled slowly, his gaze sweeping the chamber once more. Noticing now the subtle details he had missed before, the careful arrangement of objects, the absence of disorder, the sense that someone had remained here not out of necessity alone, but out of loyalty that extended beyond instruction or survival. The storm above continued without pause, but inside the frozen structure, something far heavier than weather had already been uncovered, something that had waited quietly beneath the snow for the moment it would finally be seen. Daniel Whitaker stood in the frozen chamber, holding the dog tags in his gloved hand as the weight of recognition settled deeper into him with every passing second. The light from his handheld lamp flickered slightly as the battery adjusted to the extreme cold, casting shifting shadows across the walls that seemed to breathe with memory. The air inside was still, but not lifeless, carrying a strange sense of preservation, as if time had slowed down and chosen to stay here longer than anywhere else. Behind him, faint echoes from the entrance reminded him that the storm above was still alive, still raging. Yet down here, everything felt separated from the world he had just left. He turned slowly, scanning the chamber again, this time noticing details that had blended into the background moments earlier. Along the far wall, there were markings that looked intentionally placed, not random scratches or wear, but structured indicators used for navigation or identification. Beneath them, a narrow shelf had been built into the steel frame, holding items that were clearly maintained rather than abandoned. Folded fabric, insulated gear, and carefully stored supplies suggested that someone had continued to tend to this place even when no official record would have required it. Daniel stepped closer, his boots echoing softly against the metal floor, and lowered the light toward a section of the wall where faint writing had been etched into the surface. The letters were partially obscured by frost, but as he brushed them gently with his glove, they became clearer. A unit identifier, followed by initials that matched the dog tags he had found earlier. His breathing slowed as the realization became harder to avoid. This was not simply a forgotten shelter. It was a maintained space tied directly to someone from his past unit, someone whose absence had never been fully accounted for in official reports. The German shepherd above shifted again, and a soft sound traveled down the corridor, low and steady, almost like reassurance rather than urgency. Daniel paused, letting that sound settle in his mind, then continued forward into the deeper section of the chamber where the structure widened slightly. There, at the center of the space, he found something that made him stop completely. A small table had been constructed from reinforced material, and on it were carefully arranged personal items, each placed with deliberate intention. A faded photograph, partially protected by a sealed cover, lay beside another set of dog tags, and beneath them, a folded note secured against time with tape that had long lost its original adhesion but still held its position. Daniel approached slowly, as if any sudden movement might disrupt the meaning held within the arrangement. He set the flashlight down to free both hands, then carefully lifted the photograph. The image revealed a group of Marines standing together in a training field, faces weathered but unified, and among them he immediately recognized Sergeant Michael Reeves, standing slightly off-center with a German shepherd at his side. The same white German shepherd. The realization tightened something in Daniel's chest, not with shock, but with a slow and steady understanding that what he was seeing was not a coincidence, but a continuation of loyalty beyond documented outcomes. He placed the photograph back down gently and picked up the folded note. The paper was fragile, softened by cold and time, but still intact enough to read. The words were brief, written in steady handwriting that suggested effort had been made to remain composed. Daniel read silently, his eyes moving slowly across each line as the meaning settled in layers rather than all at once. It spoke of waiting, of duty continued beyond orders, and of a promise that had not been abandoned even when circumstances changed beyond recognition. When he finished reading, he remained still for several moments, allowing the silence of the chamber to fill the space around him again. Above, the storm continued its relentless motion, but inside, everything had shifted. The German shepherd remained at the entrance, unmoving, as if it had already accepted what the humans were only beginning to understand. Daniel exhaled slowly, placing the note back exactly as he had found it, then looked once more at the arrangement before him. Nothing here was accidental. Every object carried intention, every placement carried memory, and every trace of presence pointed toward a story that had never truly ended. He tightened his grip on the dog tags in his pocket, then lifted his gaze toward the corridor leading back to the surface, knowing that what lay beneath the snow was no longer just a recovery mission, but something far more personal than he had anticipated. Daniel Whitaker remained in the frozen chamber longer than he intended, standing in silence as the meaning of what he had just read continued to settle into him. Layer by layer, like snowfall accumulating without sound. The dog tags in his pocket felt heavier now, not because of their physical weight, but because of what they represented in connection to everything around him. The carefully arranged items, the preserved structure, and the presence that had endured here far beyond what any official timeline had recorded all began forming a single narrative that refused to remain fragmented any longer. Behind him, the faint corridor leading back upward felt distant, almost detached from this space, as if the storm and the world above belonged to another life entirely. The white German shepherd had not moved from the entrance, still positioned where the corridor met the open air, its posture steady and alert, watching Daniel with quiet expectation. It did not press forward, nor did it retreat. It simply waited, as though it understood that understanding had to come before action. Daniel finally exhaled slowly and turned his attention back toward the chamber, letting his eyes trace over every detail once more. The table, the photograph, the gear, and the markings along the wall all seemed to converge into a single point of intention that pointed beyond this location, deeper into what this place had been used for after official operations had ended. He stepped closer to one of the wall sections where faint structural reinforcement patterns were visible beneath frost and time, and as he examined it more carefully, he noticed subtle modifications that suggested long-term adaptation rather than temporary use. Small repairs had been made with precision, not hastily, indicating continued maintenance over an extended period. This was not abandonment. It was stewardship. Daniel knelt again, brushing frost from another set of markings, and as the surface cleared, additional identifiers became visible, matching references he had only seen in partial mission debriefs years earlier. The realization did not arrive with sudden shock, but rather with a slow alignment of fragmented memory and present evidence. The missing gaps in reports, the unresolved field outcomes, and the absence of closure all began to connect here, inside this silent structure buried beneath miles of snow. A faint sound from above shifted his attention briefly, the wind pressing harder against the surface of the world, but down here the atmosphere remained unchanged, insulated by earth and steel. Daniel stood again and moved toward the far side of the chamber, where the light revealed a narrow passage continuing deeper into the structure. Unlike the main corridor, this passage was less maintained, its edges showing more wear, as though it had been used less frequently or reserved for specific moments rather than daily necessity. He activated his light again and began to move forward, step by careful step, the beam revealing uneven surfaces and reinforced supports that had been added after initial construction. The German shepherd above shifted position once more, and this time its sound carried a different tone, slightly more urgent, but still controlled, as if guiding rather than warning. Daniel paused briefly at the threshold of the passage, placing one hand against the wall to steady himself as he adjusted to the narrowing space. The air here felt even colder, but also more still, as if nothing had moved through this section for a long time. As he advanced, faint signs of life became visible again, not in motion, but in preservation. A second small chamber opened ahead, partially illuminated by a break in the structure above, where filtered daylight from the storm filtered weakly through cracks in the ice. Inside, additional supplies were arranged, but unlike the previous chamber, these appeared more personal, less standardized. There were markings on the wall that resembled notations rather than official identifiers, and beneath them, another set of items laid out with the same careful attention he had seen earlier. Daniel approached slowly, the beam of his light revealing a final detail that brought everything together in a way that words alone could not fully capture. A worn military patch, folded and placed deliberately beside a small collar tag, both preserved with the same intention as everything else in this hidden place. He stood still, allowing the silence to fully surround him, while the understanding of what had truly happened here began to settle beyond analysis and into something deeper. Above, the storm continued without pause, but inside the frozen structure, the past had already been waiting to be understood. Daniel Whitaker stood at the threshold of the deeper passage, the beam of his light cutting into a narrow corridor that felt older, colder, and more isolated than anything he had encountered so far inside the structure. The air here carried a stillness that was almost absolute, as if even time itself had difficulty moving through this section. Behind him, the larger chamber remained dimly visible, with its carefully arranged artifacts and preserved signs of long-term occupation. But ahead there was only darkness and the faint suggestion of something that had been sealed away with intention. He adjusted his grip on the flashlight and stepped forward slowly, each movement deliberate, his boots making minimal sound against the frost-coated surface beneath him. The corridor narrowed as he advanced, its walls reinforced in irregular intervals, suggesting adaptation over time rather than a single construction phase. Daniel noticed additional markings along the surface, some carved, some painted, all partially worn but still structured enough to indicate guidance or communication rather than random notation. As he followed the passage deeper, the temperature seemed to drop even further, and the silence became so dense that even his own breathing felt distant. He paused briefly to steady himself, placing a hand against the wall, and felt a subtle vibration pass through the structure, likely caused by wind pressure interacting with the outer shell above ground. It reminded him that the storm was still present, still active, still burying the world in motionless white, even if it felt unreachable from here. The German shepherd remained above ground, but Daniel could sense its presence still connected to this space, as if the animal's awareness extended through the structure itself. He continued forward until the corridor widened slightly into another chamber, this one less organized than the previous areas, but still clearly part of the same system. The light revealed uneven surfaces, sections of wall that had been repaired multiple times, and structural supports that suggested long-term sustainability rather than temporary shelter. Along one side, there were additional storage areas, but their contents were different, less standardized, more personal in nature. Daniel moved closer and examined them carefully. There were insulated containers, some sealed, others partially opened, and within them were preserved supplies that indicated someone had continued to maintain readiness even after official operations had ceased. He reached down and brushed away frost from a surface panel, revealing faint handwritten markings beneath, likely added after initial construction. The writing referenced dates and conditions, not in formal military language, but in practical terms that suggested lived experience rather than documentation. Daniel felt a quiet shift in understanding as he read them, recognizing patterns that aligned with survival protocols he had only seen referenced in restricted training material. This place had been used continuously, not abandoned, and not forgotten, but maintained by someone committed to its purpose long after external acknowledgement had ended. As he moved deeper into the chamber, the beam of his light caught something positioned against the far wall that immediately drew his attention. He approached slowly and found a final collection of items arranged with the same deliberate care he had seen before, but with an added sense of closure rather than continuation. A folded uniform piece lay beneath a protective covering, alongside another set of dog tags and a small worn collar fragment, each placed in a precise alignment that suggested respect rather than storage. Daniel lowered himself slightly, studying the arrangement without touching it at first, allowing the significance to settle fully before interaction. His expression tightened subtly as the remaining pieces of the narrative aligned in his mind, not as speculation, but as confirmation built from evidence gathered throughout the structure. This was not a forgotten site. It was a place of remembrance, maintained with intention far beyond duty, sustained by loyalty that had not diminished with time or absence. Behind him, faint movement echoed through the corridor, the white German shepherd shifting position again at the entrance above, its presence still connected to everything below in a way that felt less like coincidence and more like continuity. Daniel finally reached out and carefully lifted one of the remaining items, holding it under the light as the truth of the chamber settled completely around him. The storm outside continued without pause, but within this hidden space beneath the snow, something far deeper than survival had been preserved, waiting patiently until someone was finally ready to understand it. Daniel Whitaker held the final item under the beam of his flashlight, and for a long moment, he did not move at all, as if any motion might break the fragile understanding forming inside the chamber. The silence around him was no longer empty. It felt occupied, as though every object, every mark on the wall, every preserved piece of equipment was holding its breath alongside him. The deeper he looked into the arrangement, the clearer it became that nothing here had been left behind by accident or chaos. It had been preserved with intent, maintained with care that extended beyond survival instinct and into something closer to devotion. Daniel slowly lowered himself onto one knee, placing the item back exactly where it had been resting, his gloved hand lingering for a moment before releasing it completely. The weight in his chest was not confusion anymore, but recognition forming into certainty. Behind him, The faint sound of movement echoed through the corridor above, the white German shepherd shifting position again at the entrance, its presence still anchored to the structure like a silent guide refusing to leave until the truth was fully seen. Daniel turned his head slightly toward the entrance, then back toward the chamber, allowing the meaning of everything to settle without interruption. He rose slowly and began walking through the space once more, not searching now, but confirming. Each section of the chamber revealed consistency in its purpose, a repeated pattern of maintenance, preservation, and deliberate organization that extended across time far longer than any standard field protocol would require. He noticed how supplies had been rotated rather than abandoned, how surfaces had been cleared and resecured, how even the smallest elements showed evidence of continued attention. It was not the behavior of a forgotten site. It was the behavior of someone who had chosen to remain connected long after official separation. Daniel paused near the center of the chamber, the beam of light sweeping across the walls until it settled on a final section he had not fully examined before. There, partially recessed into the structure, was a sealed compartment that appeared reinforced differently from the rest of the chamber. He approached it carefully, placing his hand against the surface and feeling a faint resistance that suggested it had been locked rather than simply closed. After a brief moment of inspection, he located a manual release mechanism and applied steady pressure. The seal disengaged with a quiet mechanical sound that echoed softly through the space, and a narrow panel opened inward. Inside was a carefully preserved collection of records, physical logs stored in protective casing, arranged in chronological order. Daniel retrieved the topmost set and opened it slowly, the pages brittle but intact. As he read, his expression shifted subtly, the final gaps in understanding beginning to close. The records detailed extended survival operations conducted beyond official termination of the mission cycle, documenting continuous presence in this location under conditions that required endurance far beyond standard deployment parameters. The entries were precise, methodical, and deeply personal in tone, revealing not only logistical notes, but reflections on duty, memory, and loyalty. Daniel read further, each line reinforcing the same conclusion that had been forming since he first stepped into this structure. The German shepherd above shifted again, and this time its sound carried down more clearly, a steady, grounded presence that felt almost like acknowledgement. Daniel closed the log gently and placed it back inside the compartment before, sealing it again, not out of denial, but out of respect for what it represented. He stood there for several moments, allowing the chamber to return to silence around him. The storm outside continued its relentless movement across the mountains, but inside this hidden place beneath the snow, something had finally reached completion. Daniel tightened his grip on the dog tags in his pocket and looked once more toward the corridor leading upward, understanding now that what he had found was not simply evidence of survival, but proof of a bond that had refused to end even when everything else had. With that understanding, he began his ascent back toward the surface, step by careful step, carrying the weight of what he now knew into the storm waiting above. Daniel Whitaker emerged from the narrow access tunnel into the upper chamber slowly, the cold air from the storm immediately wrapping around him like a sharp reminder of the world above. For a brief moment, he stood still at the threshold, adjusting his eyes as the contrast between the frozen interior and the blinding white outside washed over him. The wind had not weakened. It pressed against the structure with the same relentless force, carrying fine snow that swirled in chaotic patterns across the entrance. The white German shepherd was still there, sitting exactly where Daniel had last seen it, its body partially dusted with snow, but its posture unchanged, steady and calm, as if it had been waiting through every second of his descent. Daniel stepped forward carefully, placing one boot onto the packed snow outside, then the other, feeling the immediate resistance of the storm against his body. The air was sharp, cutting, but familiar again in a way that the silence below was not. He looked at the dog for a long moment, and something unspoken passed between them, not command, not instruction, but recognition. The German shepherd rose slowly and took a few steps forward, then stopped, turning its head slightly toward the direction of the open terrain beyond the ridge. Daniel followed its gaze and saw nothing but white expanse stretching endlessly under the storm, yet the dog remained focused as if something Meaningful lay beyond what the human eye could easily see. Behind Daniel, the rest of the Marine unit began to surface from the structure one by one, each of them adjusting to the sudden return of wind and movement after the oppressive stillness below. No one spoke immediately. The weight of what they had seen remained too present, too unresolved, to be translated into words. Daniel stood between the entrance and the open field, the dog tags still secured inside his jacket, and the records he had reviewed now locked in memory rather than paper. He glanced once more at the structure behind him, half buried in snow, its existence now exposed, but still holding more answers than anyone could fully articulate in a single moment. The German shepherd let out a low, steady sound and began walking forward into the storm, not rushing, not hesitating, but moving with quiet certainty. Daniel hesitated only briefly before following, raising his hand to signal the rest of the team to maintain formation. The snow grew thicker as they moved away from the structure, gradually erasing their footprints behind them almost as quickly as they formed. The landscape felt infinite again, but the direction was no longer uncertain. The dog continued ahead, guiding them across uneven terrain shaped by wind and time, its movements deliberate and consistent despite the harsh conditions. Daniel noticed that it occasionally paused, not from confusion, but from awareness, as if confirming that those behind it were still present. As they advanced, the storm began to shift slightly, revealing faint contours of the land that had been hidden earlier. The German shepherd stopped at a higher ridge and looked back once more, its eyes steady and focused, waiting until Daniel reached the same point. When he did, he saw it too, subtle remnants of markings embedded in the landscape, partially obscured but intentional enough to suggest guidance or passage. Daniel felt a quiet tightening in his chest as understanding settled further. This was not just a recovery mission. It was a continuation of something that had never truly ended. He looked down briefly, adjusting his grip on his gear, then back toward the horizon where the dog now stood facing forward again. The storm remained powerful, unyielding, but the path ahead felt defined in a way it had not before. Daniel stepped forward once more, and the team followed, moving together into the white expanse guided by a presence that had already carried the weight of survival long before they arrived. Behind them, the hidden structure disappeared gradually into the snow, but what it had revealed remained with them, shaping every step that followed into something far greater than retrieval, something closer to understanding a bond that had endured beyond time, beyond silence, and beyond the limits of expectation.